Welcome back to another episode of 40 Facts About the 40K Universe. I am your host, Gershwan, and today we're going to be talking about what happened on the planet of Vigilus, more specifically the battle for Hive Solaris. If you're new to the channel, subscribe. We post Warhammer 40K lore videos every single day. If you have any suggestions or questions, please let me know what they are in the comment section below. I'll try to create a video for you guys. And if you guys enjoy our content, thank our patrons on Patreon. It is because of them that we can do this. Link in the description if you guys want to support us. But with that said, let's get into 40 facts on the battle for Hive Solaris. The Adeptus Mechanicus of Styges VIII has established Vigilus as a key stronghold. Teeming with Imperial citizenry, it is a planet vital to the Imperium due to its vast reserves of manpower, the energy it supplies to the many subsectors of the Segmentum Obscurus, and its status as a sole manufacturing point for the Bastion-class force fields. Since the opening of the Great Rift, Vigilus has stood at the edge of the Imperium Nihilus, essentially standing guard over one end of the infamous Nachmund Gauntlet, the best-known passage out of the warp-driven galactic north. To mankind, while Vigilus stands, it is a beacon of hope, yet the world is also a tantalizing prize for Xeno and other forces of chaos. Growing warp storms threatened to cut off Vigilus, and as the maelstrom grew, it vomited forth an Orc fleet. Here was an armada of scrapcraft beyond count. They all bore uncharacteristically powerful engines. After a brief and mostly one-sided space battle in favor of the invaders, the majority of the fleet crash-landed onto the many wastelands that skirted the sprawling hive cities of Vigilus. Using their wrecked craft to build scrap fortresses and all manner of weapons and war machines, the surviving orcs began to assail the massive hive sprawls. The Imperial forces drew back within their respective hives and sent out distress signals. Greenskin assaults followed, but they were largely turned back, stymied by the network of Bastion-class force fields that protected each of the colossal cities. It seemed as if the warp storm that deposited the orcs grew in intensity, turning into the epic anomaly known as the Great Rift. Massive psychic shockwaves rolled across the galaxy, and this surge of warp energy revealed flaws in the Bastion-class force fields, both on Vigilus and on hundreds of other worlds. Overcome by malfunctions, the Bastion force fields flickered and then failed. One of the hive cities hit hardest was Scelerus. Hive Solaris is located upon Mega Borealis, a continent over which the Adeptus Mechanicus holds sovereignty. Long ago, tech priests planted titanic drills that penetrated deep into the planet's crust, and over the course of centuries, massive hive cities of industry sprang up around each one. Of these boar hives, Solaris is a mid-sized sprawl, yet it is specially noted due to its high production of geothermic power. Located atop the Alpha-class thermal stack, Solaris alone generates over 50% of the energy needed to power the entire continent. With its great import, Solaris boasts a garrison of Skitarii legions, double that of any similar of size, as well as a formidable array of knights and an entire Titan legion. Its ruler, Tech Priest Dominus Sepulvius XIV, also sat upon Vigilus' ruling order, known as the Council of Cogs. Of final note, because of the frequency of drilling on an epic scale, all of Mega Borealis, and the boar hives in particular, are regularly subjected to earthquakes. The drilling has unsettled the planet's tectonic plates, and even the reinforced structures occasionally succumb to the planet's most violent upheavals. Before the Bastion-class force fields went down, the invaders fared poorly on the attack on Solaris. Force fields had provided a dual layer of protection. First, a psychic screen that ensured that any living thing that attempted to pass through its shimmering field fell into a coma before they took their seventh step, and any encroaching machinery tripped electromagnetic fields, sending out spiderwebs of crackling lightning that converged on the vehicles that sought to pass. Even Orc attempts to overload the force field using mass attack waves failed, as Solaris had power supplies to spare. After repeated attacks with no success, the Orcs withdrew to their scrap metal fortresses, already starting to feud amongst themselves. With the defenders having won some breathing space, the bastion fields of Solaris were powered down, and the servitor crews in their tens of thousands were sent out to clear away the Xeno debris. Although several Orcish attempts attempted to thrust into the outskirts, the shields were powered back up before any large-scale assault could be mounted. And then the smog-polluted skies grew strange. The withering clouds swirled and formed leering faces. Across the planet, cognitators exploded, and all channels of bioneric static code crackled with vile voices. Amidst the growling turmoil, the bastion force fields across Vigilus flickered, blinked, and then disappeared. The Great Rift had finally opened, nearly splitting the galaxy in two. Across Vigilus, the howling winds whipped up a great dust storm, cutting Solaris off from all Vox comms. The defenders were left, peering out into the rising storm. With all manner of pollutants stirred into the air, the dust storm proved impenetrable to vision and auspex alike. Altered to the failing shields by the skulking commandos, the orcs once more raced to the attack. The speediest contingents naturally arrived first. In the midst of the oncoming storm, the orc speedwalk spearheads accelerated towards their targets. The impressive array of weapon towers and gun emplacements that lined the perimeter's walls of the Hive Solaris had little chance at stopping the oncoming hordes. Under normal conditions, even given the planet's choked and polluted atmosphere, the guns could have opened fire when the foe was nearly a mile away. In the unnatural storm that now beset the Hive, the weapon's effective range was limited to a few hundred yards, and given the speed of the closing orc vehicles, it was no contest. Orc warbikers, war buggies, trucks, and heavier scrap tanks blasted holes through the rockcrete walls and smashed down gateways. Within moments, hundreds of orcs had broken into the Hive. Some orcs to bust from their trucks, piling out to smash into the defenders, or to loot the first building they encountered. Most greenskins, however, continued their reckless journey, moving at breakneck speeds into the iron labyrinth that made up Solaris. Completely shocked, the Adeptus Mechanicus defenders awaited orders, but Solaris' leader, Tech Priest Dominus Sepulvius XIV, did not issue any. Instead, he did something that the upper echelons of the cult Mechanicus rarely do. He froze. Alarmed by the force field's failures, the warp storm's strange effect on the machine spirit, and the sheer speed of which the orcs were penetrating deep into the urban sprawl, Sepulvius became trapped in a data loop, broadcasting no orders whatsoever. Meanwhile, the greenskins pressed their advantage, with over 100 speedwalks competing to drive deepest into the Hive. In the more open sector Mechanicus zones, such as the refineries of Craxon and the slag fields around each of the drill zones, the fast-moving orc battalions proved unstoppable. The speeding convoys streaked through the Hive, leaving a trail of wreckage behind them. Acting on protocols alone, the defenders of the Scutari were poorly coordinated. It was at that point that the Genestealer cult of Megaborealis began its uprising. Hundreds of years ago, the Adeptus Mechanicus unwittingly brought a Genestealer to Vigilus. From a single creature spawned many, until a Xenos cult had spread to infect nearly every Hive. Many miners, subterranean water harvesters, and even human parts of servitors had been infected by the Xeno seed. The cult of the Pauper Prince had not planned to rise up to conquer the world until their stranglehold upon Vigilus was lethally tied, a time they saw decades in the future. However, the Orc Invasion expedited their plans. Word was silently passed between hundreds of signalers so that across dozens of hives, the broods erupted out of the underground dwellings. The splinter of the Pauper Prince in Scelerus, the Withering Worm, was led by Magus Lygax the Prophet. With inhuman synchronicity, they burst forth in well-planned ambushes. The cult attacks caught the already paralyzed Adeptus Mechanicus forces with perfect timing. While Scutari legions stood in formation across hive choke points, waiting orders or the oncoming orcs, they instead found themselves ambushed. En masse pure-strain Genestealers poured forth from all directions to rip them apart. Elsewhere, Promethium refineries were sabotaged, their flames burning high enough to scorch through multiple levels. Using long-known passcodes, Acolyte hybrids entered defensive emplacements and unleashed slaughter. Thousands of attacks swept over Solaris, from the central pits to the lattice works of the energy pipelines. The worst was still to come, however. Although the uprising was premature, the cult had spent centuries planning their moves. It was Magus Lygax's duty to ensure that the Titan Legion stationed on Solaris never left the Boar Hive. The Magus had acquired 3 weapons of great power, and it was time to deploy the first. It had taken great effort to capture a Vortex missile, and even more to keep it hidden in the undercaves. When the silent call came, the operatives began to move alongside specially excavated tunnels that led directly into the main underground bunker complex, where the Legion Feroxis awaited the call to duty. Scores of nearby raids kept the Guardian Scutari legions occupied around the perimeter of the Feroxis compound. They were but diversions, as the real threat was wheeled upward from the depths. Too late, the Titan Legion Guardians discovered the plot, and although the Scutari and battle servitors fought with desperate valor, they could not prevent the suicide team from detonating their deadly payload. A hole in reality tore open a Warlord Titan's plasma reactor, starting a chain reaction. Standing in tight ranks, with shields powered down, the damage of the God Machine was catastrophic. It is unknown whether Dominus Apolvius XIV had his mind shrouded by the psychic powers of the Genestealer cult, if he was incapacitated by the warp storms, or if his cognitator-aided mind had merely slipped some gears. Had he been in full command of his faculties, it is doubtful he would have held the awesome power of the full Titan Legion in reserve. The final throes of Legion Feroxus unleashed a geyser of fire that ripped out of the Hive and into the stratosphere. With that, the brain-locked tech priest Dominus was placed in storage against his will, and a new leader of Solaris declared. With swift surety, Archmagos Nessius Caldrite issued long strings of command to the Scutari legions. Even before the Mechanicus defenses reorganized, the Orc momentum was faltering. Many speed mobs had drifted off to loot, while others ran short of fuel and made desperate bids to capture refineries. Lacking the direction of their supreme warlord, Cruel Deka, whose eyes were elsewhere on Vigilus, the Orcs hazardly spilled into the outer rings of the Boar Hive, fighting amongst themselves for possession of coveted loot piles. In the mayhem, Scutari kill teams hunted the undercaves of the Genestealer cultists, searching for their hidden lairs and covert operatives. Ambush after ambush followed, with each side landing blows upon the other, but making no significant headway. Frustratingly, the Mechanicus forces could never seem to bring their full might to bear against the foe. It was a war altogether different than the ones being fought simultaneously against the Orcs. Entire legions acted in concert to drive back initial greenskin incursions, clearing the heavy industry sectors in a series of large-scale battles. As the multi-year campaign advanced, the fighting ground down to a war of attrition, fought over roughly established lines drawn between the ruins. A kind of status quo came into being. Each side launched occasional all-out offensives, only to advance a few hab blocks before grinding to a halt. Afterwards, each side was content to fortify their own position for a time, regularly sending out forth patrols to harass their foe. For their part, the Orcs had squandered the majority of their vehicles in the initial onslaught, and were now rebuilding. All along the Boar Hive Solaris perimeter, the Orcs were dismantling manufactorums at an alarming rate, turning the scraps over to their mech boys so that they might repurpose them. After years of bitter fighting amongst the outer zones of Scelerus, a new phase of the battle began with the arrival of the first wave of Imperial reinforcements. The bulk of these came from a Crusade force that had been fighting in the nearby Stygus war zone, and included elements from a number of Space Marine chapters, along with many battle-hardened regiments of the Astra Militarum, most famously from Cadia and Catachan. With the Council of the Cogs in disarray, deployment of the newly arrived troops was piecemeal. There was no single leader, and various Imperial factions each used their own methods to break the siege that surrounded the Hive clusters. In Solaris, a strike force of Iron Hands from Clan Kargul arrived under the command of Captain Arland. Behind a vanguard wedge formation of 3 repulsors, the Iron Hands passed through the no man's land and penetrated the Orcs' death line, a formidable mile-long barricade that walled off Grisport, the northerlymost landing pads. There the Greenskins had scavenged the Mechanicum air fleets, turning them into their own scrap jets and devcopters. The running battle that raged amongst the various hangars, elevators, and landing pads were devastating to the newly created Orc Air Force. On the ground, the Iron Hands advanced, pouring fire into the rows of fighter bombers, while Inceptors leapt upward to the gantries that crisscrossed above, blasting Orc pilots as they raced for their machines, and shooting devcopters out of the skies. It was a major victory for the Iron Hands, and helped to reclaim the northern sector of Solaris. Meanwhile, the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus had launched their own assault against the Orcs. With the Iron Hands diverting the Orcs' attention to their scrapjet runways, Archmagos Nessius Caldrite proved himself a formidable commander. On his orders, the Scutari legions, coupled with several regiments of the Astra Militarum, overwhelmed the Death Line barriers. The Imperial forces swept forward. Wherever they met fierce resistance, Caldrite brought up the Knights of House Sabotage, a contingent that guarded the vital central zone. This left the thermal core that supplied much of the planet with energy relatively unguarded, but Caldrite interpreted this opportunity as his best chance to oust the Orcs, and he threw all of his reserves into the effort. In truth, the Archmagos may have held some back, if his reconnaissance efforts had revealed what the Orcs had been working towards in the meantime. Led by mech boss Zarkit and his mech followers, the Orcs had repurposed the archaeal tech of many manufactorums in Sector Mechanicus. Orc factories produce heavy-grade war machines, much of them up-armored with the same materials that the Adeptus Mechanicus used to protect structures against earthquakes. Under the direction of the mech boys, enslaved humans worked endless assembly lines that churned out Gorgonauts, Morgonauts, Death Dreads, Killicons, and battle wagons. Zarkit had planned to release his heavy brigade alongside air power, but following the destruction of Grisport hangars, he now sought swift revenge. The advancing forces met at a half a dozen places, including the Calceum, a massive 10-mile-long gear manufactorum. There, amidst the blackened ruins and twisted girders, knights dueled Gorkonauts and Morkonauts. Infantry on both sides sought to support their larger war machines, slipping through maze-like channels in the rubble before emerging at the enemy's flanker rear to fire heavy weaponry and then duck back down. Others rushed from behind obstacles to slap magnetic mines or demo charges onto the legs and armor plates of passing war engines. Soon the air was foul with thick smoke, and the burning wrecks of war machines littered the shattered manufactorum. The Orcs had gained the momentum, and feeding off their success, they became all but unstoppable. Fearing a breakthrough to the lightly guarded core, the Skitarii legions began a disciplined retreat at the directive of the Archmagos, falling back in good order before the clanking metal monstrosities of the Orcs. Noble to the end, the knights sacrificed themselves one by one during the withdrawal, standing alone to block narrow streets for as long as they could. Meanwhile, the Withering Worm had not been idle during this time. They knew of the Orc plan, and had launched many ambushes in an attempt to destroy the mech factories, with little success. The Magus knew an Orc victory was only a matter of time, for the Greenskins were producing war engines at a rate none of the other factions could match. In a psychic trance, he received the new plans from his patriarch. The cult still hoped to conquer Vigilus, but they would not remain in Solaris no longer. The bulk of the remaining insurgents loaded up a secret weapon and began the underground journey to Hive Ultras, leaving an army of acolytes to carry out the final suicide mission. Meanwhile, through hard, grinding battles, the Orcs advanced deeper into Solaris, and finally a second wave of Imperial reinforcements arrived upon Vigilus, led by Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines. Seeing the fractionalized and ineffective Council of Cogs, Calgar quickly stepped in as a high commander. It was not long before the various forces of the Imperium began to work in unison across all of Vigilus. In Scelerus, a strike force of Ultramarines and elements of 4 other chapters arrived in the beleaguered center of the Boar Hive. Although they numbered only in the hundreds, they were worth more than any battalion of lesser troops. They brought not just hope, but new tactics to the exhausted defenders. In the Battle of Manufacturing, the Orcs were outproducing the followers of the Machine God. Damaged facilities and long, exhausted rituals meant that every battle servitor assembled by the Tech Priest and every Skitarii Ranger repaired meant that the speedy Greenskins were able to send forth several larger constructs, such as Death Dreads. After counsel with the Archmagos, the Ultramarines helped to shore up the defensive positions, while also sending out infiltration strikes. Ranging in size from kill teams to small armies, they set out in an effort to hunt down and kill the Orc mechs. It was these inventors that directed the Xeno factories, and the scavenger teams that cut out and hauled the wreckages used for the construction. Far behind enemy lines, Reaver Squad, sniper teams, and Skitarii Rangers sought out the bright glow of mech welding torches. As the war grew on, the Orcs sought to keep up the pressure on the ever-shrinking pockets of Imperial-held territory. There were even rumors that Cruel Daka himself would arrive to ensure the capture of the power source at the thermal core. The loss of mechs was beginning to show, and fewer war machines were clanking off the assembly line. The Orcs ran out of patience. The steady war of attrition was still in their favor, but the Greenskins grew restless. The war bosses shouted for a final push, and at last, Mech Boss Zarkit relented, throwing everything he had into a final assault to tear into the Boar Hive's heart. Dread mobs equipped with wrecking balls led the charge, with hundreds of them advancing into a hail of fire. No gun line or stronghold could stand before them. Behind the metal mass swarmed thousands of Orc infantry, so that every avenue of approach was filled with Greenskins. With nowhere left to retreat, Imperial forces prepared for their last stand, sending urgent telepathic messages to Marneus Calgar for aid. It was then that both the Orcs and the armies of the Imperium discovered the ploy of Solaris' Genestealer cult army. Too late, they diverted their forces, and their desperate attempts could not halt the acolytes from deploying the radiation bomb they had secreted into the Imperial territory. While they had not stopped the detonation, they did prevent the device's optimal placement within the thermal core. As it was, the resulting quake shook the continent, but not the world. Crowned with a mushroom cloud, the 12-year-long fight for Solaris was finally over, but the battle for Vigilus would rage on. And those were 40 facts on the battle for Hive City Solaris. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I keep wanting to say Hive Fleet Solaris. I think it's because I was talking about Genestealers, and Tyranids are on my mind. I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and I hope it goes to show you how Vigilus was pretty narratively awesome, as much as like I felt like, because it was the Primaris founding, the Indomitus Crusade, Vigilus, and then it was the whole the latest thing with the awakening, the psychic awakening. But the Vigilus part, I felt like was a lot quicker and very like old school Warhammer, where it was just like kind of like Apocalypse or Armageddon, where they just threw a story at you and there was narrative hooks and it was up to you to build it. But like this story and that way of telling a campaign story, I think is still pretty cool, because it's ambiguous enough for you to create your own lore for the Battle of Vigilus, but at the same time it's very structured in that it showed you who was fighting where, which is kind of cool. This story actually comes from a box set that GW sold during 8th edition. I forget what the name of the box set is, but it's like City or Battle Cities, Cities of Battle or something like that. But basically it showed you how to create a narrative story for your 8th edition battle reports or your games. So as you went along, you got a map, and you could actually like win certain areas, certain hab blocks, certain manufactorum districts, and important parts of the Hive city. It was really cool. But the badass thing about what GW did is that in 9th edition, that's all free in the core rulebook. So if you go to 9th edition core rulebook, there's a thing called a crusade. So you could run a crusade, and it's basically the same thing as the city of battle or battle cities or something like that. Basically where this story came from. So if you are into the narrative portion of Warhammer 40K, if you like the lore, you want to create your own lore, you're into like homebrewing chapters and all that kind of stuff, 9th edition is the best time for you to start an actual tabletop army, just because once you buy the core rulebook, it gives you the how-to on how to create a narrative campaign, and they call it a crusade. And that's something that our play group is doing right now. So really recommend you guys getting into 40K right now if you're into the lore. Just because GW seems to be going down the route of like giving us that narrative hook for free. So it's pretty awesome. For now anyways. Once the codexes start rolling out, and once like the new updates start rolling out, that might change. But still, this is the time for you guys to create a badass army. And homebrew it in a way. If you guys have suggestions for any other battles that you guys would like me to talk about, any questions, let me know in the comment section below. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. This was Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate signing out.
To put my freedom first in any situation. I knew I never had that much to lose.